Good morning and welcome to MIT. My name is Quentin Palfrey. I'm the Executive Director of JPAL North America, and I'm thrilled to have such a terrific group here today. Before we begin, I want to thank the members of the JPAL staff who pulled together this terrific event. So those of you who have put on conferences in the past know it's an extraordinary amount of work. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank the work of Vincent Kwan, of Molly Gilmore, of Todd Hall, and of Hannah Meyer. If we can give them a round of applause. And I'm just thrilled to have such a diverse group of experts from all different vantage points on these sets of questions who've come from all over the country. Selfishly, I'm really thrilled that some of my favorite people from government and public policy circles have traveled here to be with us today. And I'm looking forward to a really rich and exciting conversation about education technology and personalization and the digital divide. This is a conversation we're going to have both in the room and also today's conference will be live streamed. We're also going to be on Twitter. So if you're joining us on the live stream, or if you're in the room and you want to tweet, we'll be using the hashtag EdTech, and we tweet at JPAL_NA. So JPAL is the Poverty Lab here at MIT, and our mission is to fight poverty by ensuring that social policy questions are informed by scientific evidence. And so I want to start with the socioeconomic justice aspect of this question, just to kind of set the frame. So we're a little more than 60 years past the landmark ruling of Brown versus Board of Education. And I think it's fair to say that the promise of Brown remains, in large part unfulfilled. So Brown versus Board of Education, you all know, is the landmark ruling that outlawed segregation and made the sort of moral travesty of separate but equal technically illegal. And yet our education system, more than 6 decades on, remains really deeply segregated. Gary Orfield at UCLA has done some really interesting work on this, but essentially we see the same sort of patterns of racial segregation that we saw many decades ago. And similarly, the promise of equality has been unfulfilled. We still see dramatic gaps in terms of opportunity and achievement along racial lines. And we see children of color, falling behind relative to white students in the school systems. We see poor kids entering high school several grade levels behind their wealthier counterparts. So there's a lot of work to do. And in the 21st century, we also have to think about, as sort of technology transforms all aspects of our society, our economy, our health system, our education system, the sort of digital analog of this is the digital divide. So we have 34 million people without access to high-speed internet. That's about 10% of the population. And unsurprisingly, that's disproportionately concentrated among poor people, people of color, people in rural areas, disadvantaged backgrounds. So I think that as we sort of think about the exciting and dynamic possibilities of transformation in the space, we also have to keep in mind this baseline of a shamefully unequal education system. And we have to think about the ways in which the changes that we're contemplating and that we're excited about have the potential either to help us narrow those gaps or have the danger of causing those to widen still. So that's the downer to start with. I want to spend a lot of today on the explosion of innovation and the transformational possibilities of education technology. And we have in the room today and on our agenda a number of really dynamic and terrific speakers and people who can highlight some of the ways in which technology is being harnessed to transform education. And one of the most exciting possibilities in this sort of moment is the possibility that technology can enable personalization. So one of the things that we know about education is that learners learn better when you can target the instructional materials at what they need to know at their right level. And technology has an enormous amount of potential to supercharge the kinds of pedagogical strategies that really meet learners where they are. There's other possibilities as well. We can engage learners in innovative ways. We can increase access, if we do it right, to underserved groups. We can overcome some of the spatial mismatches between learners and educational resources. And of course, we can provide teachers with new tools to strengthen their pedagogical approaches. And so I hope we'll spend a good deal of time today sort of thinking about the promises of the educational technological revolution. And we'll hear about the explosion of innovation in this space. And I hope we also keep in mind some of the perils and some of the challenges. So former FCC Commissioner Jessica Rosenworcel highlighted sort of the 21st century challenge of the homework gap. So teachers increasingly taking advantage of these new opportunities are assigning homework that requires the utilization of new technologies. And yet we know that a large number of students do not have access to technology, to reliable internet in their home. And so, what emerges is the potential or the danger of a homework gap, of a new digital learning divide. And of course, this is likely to be disproportionately borne by disadvantaged students who may not have the opportunity to engage with innovative technologies, with new approaches, or not have the ability to take advantage of the transformational possibilities of this space. Luckily, there's an enormous amount of innovation in that space as well, and this is something that policymakers at all different levels recognize as an important public policy priority. And so we'll hear today, and I know many of you are at the forefront of efforts to bridge this digital learning divide, to come up with new and innovative approaches to help make sure that poor kids and people of color and people in rural areas and other sort of disadvantaged groups have access to the tools that they need to succeed. So we'll hear today from Karen Cater, the CEO of Digital Promise, about some of the exciting things that they've been doing to get technology into the hands of kids. There are innovative approaches that President Obama has highlighted about driving buses with Wi-Fi around poor neighborhoods to make sure that kids have access to technology at night. We'll hear from David Edelman, who, along with Kumar Garg and some other colleagues in the White House, played a key role in unleashing an enormous number of new resources to put Wi-Fi and broadband into schools and into homes through the ConnectEd and Connected Home initiatives. We'll hear about other exciting innovations where people are putting ingenuity into the question of how are we going to solve some of these problems and make sure that children have the tools that they need to learn. But I think one of the things we need to recognize at this sort of pivot point in American education is that we don't have all the answers and that not everything that we try works. And this is something that's near and dear to our hearts here at J-PAL. So J-PAL spends a lot of time thinking about how to use rigorous scientific methods to ensure that we generate evidence about new interventions, that we learn what works. And this is a hard problem. If you have scarce resources, both in terms of your time and your energy, policymaker attention, and you're trying to figure out how to solve these important problems, it's a really hard question. And it's also a super high stakes question. So if we spend tens or hundreds of millions of dollars on things that don't work, rather than on things that do, real people's lives are affected. Real people's opportunities are either unlocked or are thwarted. And you know, the analogy that I like to draw sometimes is to the bad old days of medieval medicine. So you all are familiar with you know, the problem of medieval doctors. They like to use leeches on a whole range of maladies. And the doctors would say, all right, well, if I applied the leech and the patient got better, you know, hooray, the leech cured the patient. And if they apply the leech and the patient doesn't get better, they say, oh, it's too bad, I didn't get to the leech in time. And the difficulty was that there's only one patient, and it's very hard to know what the effect of the treatment was. Did the leech make the patient better? Maybe the leech made the patient worse, but the patient got better on his or her own. And this is a problem that we've largely solved in modern science, right? So under similar circumstances in the medical context, what would we do now? We would run a randomized controlled trial, and what we would do is we would take a population of people who were statistically similar, and then we would flip a coin. And half of the folks would get a treatment, and half of the folks would get a placebo. And through that method, we would be able to discern what actually the effect of that treatment was. And we would be able to tell whether it made the patient better, or maybe it made the patient worse, or maybe it had no effect. And you know, sometimes in science, there's a silver bullet, right? So sometimes you find penicillin and it cures a whole disease category. But actually, usually that's not the way it works. Usually, there's a little bit of progress, or maybe there's a little bit of a setback. But cumulatively, through the process of scientific exploration, we build up a body of knowledge. And that body of knowledge, through RCTs in the medical context, has led to an extraordinary series of advances in knowing what works in medical interventions. So why do we use randomization? Well, it allows us to draw counterfactual, right? It allows us to see not only what happens before and after, but what would have happened if you hadn't done the intervention. And then you can measure the impact. And sometimes it's actually the case that what would have happened if you did nothing was even better, and you can measure that as well. So randomization allows you to measure the causal impact of the program. It allows you to ensure that the treatment group and the comparison group are equivalent on average, with the exception of the treatment. And it also allows us to unpack this correlation and causation problem. So let's take a hypothesis from the education technology world, a relatively common hypothesis. So let's say that we think that there's some kind of an association between owning a computer and math test scores. So you can see why you might get this idea. It seems that there is actually a fairly high association between owning a computer and having high test scores. So let's see, but we don't know whether owning the computer causes the higher test scores, or maybe there's something about the group of people who owns computers that also is associated with their having higher math test scores, but doesn't actually cause it. So we can test this. So how would we test this? Well, one thing you could do is you could find a group of students who come from households that don't have computers. You could divide them randomly into two groups, a treatment group and a control group, and you could give half of the households a computer, and then you could test what happened to their test scores and see whether giving them a computer actually moved the dial. And maybe it does, and maybe it doesn't, but then you have a little bit of data about what happens, and you can do it at a small enough scale so you're not spending an enormous number of resources on an expensive intervention if it doesn't work. So we take the group, we divide them completely randomly, and then we give half of them the intervention, half of them have the previous resources that are available to them. And it turns out in this example that providing free home computers to low-income kids in California didn't have the effect that we were hoping for. So there were no effects on educational outcomes, grades, standardized test scores, attendance. So this is a little bit of a discouraging result, right? It does, to some extent, confirm something that I think that we know, which is that technology is not a silver bullet in the education context or in other kinds of contexts. So I was talking this over with a friend of mine, a guy named Tom Khalil, who's been a really sort of transformative figure in technology in a whole bunch of areas. And he said, you know, what you have here is you have the underwear gnomes problem. And I said, come again? And he said, you know, from South Park. And I was like, well, I don't watch South Park. You have to explain that to me. And he said, well, you know, there was this episode where they stole, the kids saw that their underwear was being stolen, and they found out that it was a bunch of gnomes that were stealing it. And they went and they found the gnomes, and the gnomes explained their business plan. And they said, step 1 is steal the underpants. Said, step 2, we haven't quite figured out yet. And step 3 is profits. So he said, you have the same problem here. So we know that step 1 maybe add technology, but we're still kind of working out step 2. And you know, step 3 is test scores improve. Now, luckily, I'm being a little bit flip here, right? Luckily, we know a little bit about phase 2. There's some really terrific things that we're testing in phase 2. But I think that it's important to start with the background knowledge that that technology may not be the absolute silver bullet here, and that we may need to do a little bit more thinking to try and figure out what are the other ingredients. So what is JPAL, and what do we do, and how and why are we here? So thinking about, one way to think about JPAL is that we are a network of affiliated researchers, mostly economists, at top research universities around the world. And what we do is we run randomized controlled trials to assess the efficacy of social programs and to generate evidence about what works, and then to scale and replicate effective solutions. And through this approach, we have about 350 staff. We've done about 800 randomized controlled trials of a whole bunch of different categories of social programs all over the world. And we've touched more than 300 million lives through the scale-up of these programs. And what we do is a combination of essentially 3 things. So we do research, but we also spend some of our energy building the capability of our partners, so state and local governments, nonprofits, philanthropists, schools, to roll out pilots, innovations, new programs in a way that incorporates evidence and that allows us to learn from important hypotheses. We also spend time on policy outreach, so trying to disseminate what people in our network and others in the academic community have learned about what works, so that we can help policymakers make evidence-informed decisions. So Phil Oriopoulos, who is one of our sector chairs in the education sector, is going to walk through some of the evidence that we've gleaned so far, and some of our sort of gap analysis of of what we know and what we think we need to know in this space. But let me tell you a few previews. So one of the things that we've learned through randomized controlled trials over the last few years is that it's really important to teach students at the right level. That if you can teach students material that's appropriate for their learning level, you can move the dial on their test scores. A related insight that we've learned, and this is in the analog context, but it has lots of digital applications, is that intensive tutoring, again at the right level, is something that can also move the dial on test scores. And this is a little bit of a counterpoint to some of the discouraging thinking that if you don't get to kids at the very early age that it's hard to move the dial. These are interventions that that have proven successful a little later on. Phil will talk about some of his own research about texting students and some of the ways that that's been helpful. We'll hear from CellEd about some exciting mobile-based adult ed interventions that they've seen some good results with. And more broadly, the goal here is that as we sort of celebrate the promise of educational technology and the promise of personalization, and also as we are exploring strategies for mitigating the peril of the digital divide and of further widening the shameful gap between rich and poor and between people of different races, that we need to combine innovation with rigorous research. We need to create an ecosystem of evaluation to go along with the ecosystem of innovation. What we want to do is roll out new ideas in a way that allows us to generate evidence about what works and what doesn't. We want to avoid diverting resources to ineffective programs, and we want to identify and scale up effective technologies and effective strategies. And as I mentioned in the medical example, the goal is not once and for all to answer the right approach, the right question. It's to build a body of evidence based on scientific inquiry that cumulatively transforms our understanding about what are effective interventions. So that's our challenge, and that's what we're going to spend a lot of today thinking about and working on, and I hope that we will have an opportunity to work with a number of you across a whole bunch of different walks of life and pieces of this puzzle to explore some of these questions going forward. So we're actively sort of looking for new partners across this spectrum, new research opportunities, new opportunities to work with foundations, new opportunities to work with policymakers, and we would love to begin that conversation today.